Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this session, Rebuilding Writing Skills in Key Stage 3 English. Now, if you are joining the chat, perhaps you could just pop your name and school and the sorts of concerns you have in the chat, and we may or may not get onto those particular ones, but I hope that through the session we're able to deal with them. I'm going to start. Hi there, sorry if I may have just already given this introduction, but I'll just say it again now. I'm Mike Gould, and I'm going to be giving this presentation on rebuilding writing skills in Key Stage 3 English. If you're just joining us now, perhaps you could pop your name and school, if you wish to, in the chat, and any particular concerns that you might have, just say hello. It'd be great to see who you are and where you're coming from. Just by way of introduction for myself, my background is that I was a subject leader of English in 2 secondary schools, and then moved on to working as a lecturer in education creative writing at the University of Brighton. In between, I had a stint in publishing, and in recent years, I've worked in advisory work and consultancy, and doing a lot of writing on education matters, particularly in English. So that's my potted history, and I'm just going to now talk to you about this topic of rebuilding writing skills in English. So I think where I want to start is to talk about the context for this. When I first started teaching, the English advisor who gave a presentation to all the new heads of English read a poem by Gareth Owen called Miss Creedle Teaches Creative Writing. And it's a great poem. If you can find it, I think it's online somewhere. And it's all about a teacher who basically gives a blank page to students who are struggling, and the poem is about their struggle with the blank page. And that always stuck with me. And I think in recent years, we've come around to the notion that just giving a child a blank page is never going to work, and we do need structures. And that's something we don't need to repeat, really. Nevertheless, the idea of a piece of extended writing and the difficulty in doing that can manifest itself in lots of ways. Sometimes it's almost a form of shame, not being able to admit that as a student you can't do it, or you don't have the tools, the language, or the resilience. And I suppose at other times there's a defiance that real world writing doesn't require very much extended writing, if any at all, as far as they see it. And I guess the motivation we often provide in the form of, well, you need to do it in your GCSE English exam, isn't always as compelling as it might be. For those who think they might fail anyway, being reminded that the very thing they're bad at is the goal, that can be a turn-off, I think. Of course, other students do find the end goal of GCSE success, however that's framed, a sort of driver of attainment. But finding an approach which pays attention to both the assessment but doesn't make it the obsessive motivator seems to be one we should explore. I think the other context I want to think about is that I remember talking to some modern language teachers about a time when they were given a whole hour or double lessons for modern languages. And they objected to this because they felt that language learning was best done in very small chunks. And on the other hand, English teachers generally felt they wanted the whole hour, they wanted even double lessons sometimes would be seen as something they would want. But actually, there's quite a lot of research. I think Rosenshine, I can't remember his first name, in 2012, talked about the need for small steps when you're introducing new material. And I guess that whilst we might say if a student's coming up from year 6 that the material they get in secondary school isn't necessarily new, nevertheless, it's in a new context, and it can be daunting for all sorts of reasons, particularly if we've had the sorts of challenges that have existed over the last 2 to 3 years and which continue now. And that kind of then linked in for me with the core idea of Couch to 5K. Now, for those of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but this app is a running app. and I think it's BBC who produced it. But and essentially, my understanding of it, and I've not done it, but I know my wife has, is that if you're not a runner, you start out by doing very small bits of perhaps walking for a minute, running for another minute, walking for 2 minutes, running for 2 minutes, until you build up over the course of a period of time to being able to run 5 kilometers. And I guess to me, it bears a kind of uncanny resemblance to how some students might think about extended writing. You hate running, but deep down you like to get a bit fitter. In the same way, you're not that enamored of GCSE, perhaps even not aware of what it demands. But anyway, you already feel that you're, quote, not good at writing, unquote. But deep down, you'd love to be better than you are today. So do you set off for trying to run 5 kilometers, even though you know by the time you reach the lamppost at the end of the road, you'll be gasping for breath? Do you repetitively fail to produce an extended piece of GCSE level writing straight off? So I guess it's better to listen to that podcast voice advising you to run for 1 minute, walk, then run for 2 minutes, until you build up through small steps to the point where you're a bit fitter, until suddenly, almost imperceptibly, you check your watch and you've done it. You've run 5K. And equally, you're sitting at your exam desk, and when you turn over the paper, you feel you can tackle that blank page, even, dare I say, enjoy it. So that was the background to the sort of thinking that's gone into the program for the pack that myself and Richard Vardy, my co-author, produced. This idea of how could we build up the stamina of students so that they could get to a point where they could write in an extended way, without the sort of fear that comes from not having the tools or the stimulation or the motivation to do that. So I'm going to kind of talk about 5 key points that I think are worth bearing in mind in this sort of program. I think the first one is that a simple overall focus is important. In our pack, we talk about focusing on extended narrative, descriptive, and what we might loosely call opinion writing. But really, the overall goal is confidence and resilience. So yes, we focus on those 3 areas because they are the ones that are most commonly expected at GCSE, and in a sense, most of the writing skills that you would do are going to be covered within it. But actually, getting those students to write with confidence and resilience is the real goal. And if the skills can be built alongside that, then I think that's great. And I think as part of that, and you have to start with some sort of, I suppose, what you call a fitness check. And I'm sorry to kind of create these puns around the idea of the couch to 5K, but in a way, I think it's an appropriate one. The first question I want to know about any class I teach is, what do I know about you? This could encompass social and familial background, but in the context of English, what do I know about what you can and can't do at this moment? Because we all know that students come up from year 6 with their SAT scores. They might come up with a whole package of measures and notes about what they can and can't do. But you kind of want to know what they can do there and then. And so I think, some sort of diagnosis, how fit or unfit are your students, is important. You probably already have some sort of initial barrier test or assessment that students sit when they come into stage 7. You might have one that you just do yourself in your class. You may have one that's cross department. You may have a school one, something like the CATS tests. But in the end, it's the class that sits in front of you on the 6th of September, lesson 3, that you want to know about. And perhaps the real question is for you is, what do you want to know? And if you're not getting it from elsewhere, then you need to get it for yourself. What we've done in our pack is that we've asked them to write a narrative, descriptive, or discursive task, but it is with some initial support, certainly not a blank page. And it may be that some students are not able to write anything at all, but I guess you need to know that too. Others will complete it, but they'll reveal those areas that they do well or struggle with. And I guess once you have that information, you've got a pathway you can set for students. And I should say, I'm not talking about a differentiated learning program for each student. That's exhausting, and its benefits, I think, are at best unproven. There's a lot to be said for the sort of group activity, the shared experience that classes have with shared learning. But certainly a broad perspective of what some of your students in particular clusters might need help with. It will help you set up a focus program of sessions for your recovering students. I use the term advisedly. So that's the first thing. And, to some extent, that'll be meat and drink to you. It's something probably you already got in your department. If you haven't, I think that'd be a question you need to ask either of your own head of English, or if you're the head of department looking at putting that in place. I think the next thing really to think about, and again, it is sort of obvious, but I talked at the beginning about the way in which the extrinsic motivation of a GCSE or a score at the end of the year, or even a report card or whatever it is they're taking home, doesn't always work. The best motivations, it's always intrinsic. Students do a task because it's engaging, not because it's useful or have some abstract perceived future benefit. And I think if you're going to forensically teach the language or grammar skills, you better make sure the work is interesting and integrated. You could think about this as the hook, the thing that will get them or keep them interested. I've written quite a lot on grammar, did a book on grammar for GCSE, in which really everything about the language and the grammar was about how it informed expression. And I suppose in this program that we've developed, it's about how the hook can draw them in. And I think about it in terms of even each very small activity you teach, whether it's for 2-3 minutes, having a little theme or idea behind it. For example, one lesson we've developed on the potentially boring focus of paragraph lengths, we focused all the work on a stormy river voyage. So my planning for that lesson probably would read: focus objectives, variety of paragraph lengths for effects in stories, hook, stormy river trip. And in a way, I think that almost just those noted objective with a hook, it's just a scribbled idea for each of those tasks, is a useful thing to do. And you'll come up with much better ones, I'm sure, than I could come up with my very old brain now. But I think those are important, particularly if the students have fallen behind. And I'm not talking about entertainment here. Each of these hooks has to have a purpose, but they're hooks nevertheless. I often hear about the idea of the big question at the start of a lesson or a scheme. I'm kind of more interested in the little questions. How can I make this paragraph about a stormy river trip exciting to read? So that'd be my little question, rather than the big questions of, can I improve my overall structure of stories? And because I'm sort of nerdy like this, I'm going to go back to the idea of the couch to 5K running analogy. I suppose it's the equivalent of making sure any run you do has lots of corners, different streets, changes in direction, rather than running along a straight road and back. Anything to take your mind off the slog. So I suppose in the lesson plan, the surprise change, the mixing it up, as well as the satisfaction of the fulfilled task, work well. So I think that's where we are with the background and the general idea. And now just to kind of drill down into it at a more sort of granular level, I want to talk a bit about this workout concept. And within it, I think there are 3 key focuses which seemed important to me. And I think the first is this notion of achievability. I talked about, I think his name is Rosenshine, and he talked about this idea that need small steps for new material, because students almost need to see that they can do them rather than be overwhelmed by a large package of new things all at the same time. So I think beginning with the small steps, I think even if they can already do those tasks, they're not going to do them for long. So if they're coming to them and it is knowledge they already have, it's going to be so short, it's not going to matter too much in terms of wasting time. but doing them and succeeding is an end in itself, and therefore it gives that confidence. So yes, they might already know how to create a noun phrase because that's something they've done at year 6. But the question will come back, you're not stretching or challenging your students enough, but I see no harm in these easier first stages. We've called them sort of small steps and strengthening the core in our pack. And for me, they are like 10 to 20 minute mini sessions to be run as guided groups in class, for example, while your more confident students work on something else, or as mini tutorial sessions outside class, if that facility is on offer. And Richard, my co-author, and I linked these to vocabulary and sentence tasks simply as a way of creating a kind of comprehensive structure to learning. But even in these mini sessions, I think the work always has to end with some sort of ratchet up in terms of demand, some sort of free writing, even if that is just writing 2 sentences on their own. I mean, none of this is particularly revolutionary. You will have already run small sessions yourself, I'm sure, for your classes or weaker students. You will have already worked with guided groups. But I think the key here, for these at least, is to make those initial mini sessions have quite limited goals. This isn't about mastering how to use vocabulary, though that's great if that happened. It's about that final little free writing task. Can they do it? Can they achieve that first little jog for 2 minutes without exhausting themselves? So if you can get them to that point, I think that's great. So there's that. I think the second point, which I think of as being really important, and again links into this couch to 5K analogy, is this idea of repetition and reiteration. Any run you do is a repetition of sorts of what's gone before. And I like the idea that if students have had a session, however short, on, say, using pronouns in the openings of stories for a year 7 lesson, it'd be good to come back in year 8 or whenever you choose to an equivalent, slightly more demanding mini session on pronouns used in a slightly different way, for example, for fluency and tone in discursive writing. And again, in year 9, for emphasis in persuasive writing. It doesn't have to be across 3 years. It could be 3 terms or even 3 weeks, even 3 days if you felt you wanted to dedicate a very kind of concerted, focused workshop on those things. We produced a planner in the book that you could use if you wanted to, but you'll have your own schemes you want to use. But I think that familiarity of, I've done pronouns as a student, and now here's a new thing, and I can, I'm now getting a new challenge, which I'm going to be asked to take on with a slight push to do more, is quite compelling. And I think then the third thing is this idea of stamina, and it's perhaps the most important part of the program as we envisaged it, is that by working from short, achievable mini sessions, you increase in length the demand to longer sessions of perhaps 20 to 30 minutes on more complex structural skills. So students ultimately end up with a sort of, we call them fit for purpose sessions of about 25 to 30 minutes. They're fit for purpose because when they get to that point, they have the skills in order to do the extended writing. And I suppose they're designed more for the end of term or for the end of a sequence or a scheme. And it's about a sort of leap of faith of letting go of the supports and seeing if those students can now write independently. So in summary, it's moving from small steps and strengthening the core, and I'll come back to that phrase in a little while, mini sessions on vocabulary and sentences, through what we've called stretching yourself, which is teaching or tutorial sessions on structure, which is that bit more difficult, I think, to the fit for purpose, which is the goal, which is the whole extended writing. I think we've got a slide, I think, that we're hopefully going to show you so that you can see that the program in terms of what it looks like. Yeah, so you can see here. So this is just a very simple overview of how we've structured it. And this will look like lots of schemes of work that you may already have in school. It's no surprise that you may spend less time and smaller amounts of time of vocabulary and on sentences before developing into longer sessions which require longer text to look at, more bringing together of ideas in order to create that whole text approach. So yeah, so that's where we are with that. So I want to go on now to the next aspect, which is really linked to it, which is that it really is about exercising the mind. I think it's sometimes easy to forget when we're teaching English, when we're looking at a pen on paper or tapping on a screen, that in fact everything goes on in the head. You know, that's exactly where things begin and where the cognitive links are made. And so I've used this analogy of couch to 5K, but it's not a gimmick. I don't want it to be seen as a gimmick. We exercise the brain as much as we do the body for a start. But even in this program, we have a set of teaching sessions called Strengthening the Core. And that's not a joke. It isn't accidental. These sessions on strengthening the core are about sentences and their construction. And it could be, indeed, I'd argue these are the core of writing. And by practice, writers do make themselves fitter. So I'd argue that doing more writing, almost any writing, is itself a good thing. And this is easier if the steps are shorter. It builds the habit, and the habit can lead to longer distances, if you like. So let's get the same students to do more writing, but just make it more manageable and not daunting. I had to think about this. We've got an activity from the pack, which I wondered if you wanted to look at. So it's an activity about participle phrases, that sexy thing which we all think about all the time. And I want just to talk about it before perhaps asking you to have a look at it if you want to. So this is what you're going to see on the screen, if it's not already up there, is yeah, so it's a worksheet, and this is what the student will see. It's part of that sequence of strengthening the core sessions on sentences, and it's part of a descriptive writing strand that we've developed. So it can be linked to a range of similar short sessions on other aspects of vocabulary and paragraphs. And the final culmination of doing this, quite a lot of very short sessions, is to write a full-length descriptive task at the end of the term or the scheme of work. As you'll see on this particular worksheet, every session run by the teacher or the small tutor group, a small group tutor, has a sort of a key information zone. So in theory, these are tasks that could be done independently, as well as through supported guided groups, or indeed whole class. I mean, I would say I think these are better mediated by a tutor or a teacher. But you know, at a stretch, a student could take this away and do this as a homework or something like that. You'll also notice it's not on this first screen, but when we come on to the second one, you'll see that every session or set of tasks always ends with a free writing task, however short. There's an accompanying lesson plan, which we'll quickly look at, which is on the next slide, which suggests this is a session of between 10 and 20 minutes. I think if you're busy and you're building the rest of your classwork around teaching a novel, or you're looking at types of argument writing in newspapers or whatever it is, you don't necessarily want to take a big chunk out of that lesson to deal with these things, but you might still feel that there's that cohort of students, that group of students, might be quite large, for whom this 10 or 20-minute burst of short, sharp focus is very important. So yeah, so what I was going to say, just to very quickly say, it's going to be picked up on, but there is a very slight tweak in there, which is that we talk about in one of the tasks, I think it's task 2, to find past participle participles is actually participle phrases that you're looking for. I think there are 5 past participles and 3 participle phrases. So just bear with us on that one. If you'd like to have a go at the final task, and if you feel free, love to see those ideas for your free writing in the chat, but equally doesn't matter, don't feel you have to either. And I'm going to shut up and let you do that for 5 minutes. Yeah, just seeing some great ideas in the chat. I like the cawing ominously that somebody has sent in. Let's go back and see who it was. That was at Alina. Yeah, and I think Fahim was right about the way in which it enhances the meaning of everything being old and stuck in the past. Okay, I'm going to move on because of time, and I want to give a chance for people to um, ask any questions at the end. So I'm just going to go back into talking about the program. Continue to pop things into the chat if you want to. You might not have a chance to read them aloud or respond to them now, but I'll certainly look at them at the end. I wanted to conclude the presentation by going back to the whole area of writing as a discrete skill. This may seem an odd thing to mention, as I'm sure you'd also say, well, of course, we're bound to teach writing. We teach writing skills all the time. And in which case, I suppose the questions I'm going to ask are not needed. But for a belt and braces approach, here goes. So these three questions, I think, I actually took them from a leaflet we produced for all schools back in under the old National Literacy Strategy from many years ago, which I was involved with, to show my age there. And these were three of the questions from some work which we put out to schools. So question one is, do our plans make specific reference to writing as a coherent and discrete skill for development? And as I say, that may seem the most obvious question in the world, but I have seen quite a lot of plans which are full of students, what they're doing and the areas they're working in, but actually in terms of the writing skills, there's very little about what those skills are. So that's the first question. And as I say, most of you, I'm sure, have already got that within your plans. And I suppose the second is, do we have, or do I have as a teacher, a broader curriculum map for the year or the key stage, which summarizes the sort of progression we expect to see in writing across that period of time? Now, it might be that your department doesn't believe in linking kind of progression in writing to an age. And in a sense, that doesn't matter. I think it's the idea that you have some form of progression that you look at. And it may be that enables you then to look at the way you can use a reiterative approach to come back to things without making it so overly complicated that you lose yourself in pages and pages of curriculum planning. And I suppose the third question, which is perhaps the one that relates most to what I've been talking about, do we have a specific approach or pedagogy which applies to writing, which you've identified for those students who we feel have fallen behind where we believe they should be, and how you define that is entirely up to you. And that may be different from those for other students. And I think if the answer to any of those is no, then I like to think that the pack that we've developed with Collins might help. I mean, one, because we have done a huge planning grid which does all those things, which hopefully you could slot in alongside your scheme of work. But equally, because I think it fits in with the sorts of small step approaches which I talked about at the beginning. And I guess if I wanted you to go away from this session with any key messages from my and Richard, my co-author's perspective, from our experience and from creating this program, they would be: look at how you might include lots of short focus sessions with lots of writing opportunities. I could almost not overestimate, if that's the right phrase, maybe overestimate the number of very small, lots of opportunities, lots of practice. And that goes back to, say, this, Rosenshine's research into lots and lots of practice. I'd also say, if you can, and again, I realize this is a demand on your time, if every activity you do has a hook, however simple or basic, something just jot down on your planner which goes alongside that activity, something you know is going to catch the attention of the students, great. And finally, I suppose it's to keep that couch to 5K principle in mind for these learners. Repeat, reiterate, and then ratchet up learning in steps until independence is reached. And Thank you. That's all from me on the presentation, but look forward to picking up on any questions you might have. Pop them into the chat if you want, or while you're thinking about that, there was some questions from earlier on in the session from Swapan. I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. You've asked whether writing is a culmination of all skills. How far is it true? Well, I think I talked a bit about it being as much about cognition and the brain as it is about the transcriptive act of writing. So in that sense, I think there's some truth to that. And I certainly think in your second question, you asked about whether we need to read widely to accomplish writing skill and style. I think, that's definitely the case. I think the challenge we obviously have is a lot of students, well, we think they're not reading widely. They probably are more than we think. I mean, I've argued for a long time that we tend to in schools have done traditionally prioritized what we think of as academic literary fiction over other forms of writing. And actually, a lot of our students, and I can speak from experience that my own daughter did English A-level, and she didn't seem to read a great literature, but she was a very skilled writer because of all sorts of other writing that she, reading that she did. I think your third question was a solid foundation in grammar. Is it a key to developing good writing skills? I never did any grammar when I was at school, but I think I was lucky to be surrounded by books and other forms of learning and in a pre-digital world, which meant that they kind of went in through the in osmosis. I don't think that's the case for lots of students now. Karen has asked, asking yes about the idea that over elaborate writing can occur when they spend almost too much time on sub clauses and effects. And I think that's an incredibly valid point. I think that's partly why I think it's quite useful to focus on. I think I said at the beginning that it's important to focus on the overall resilience in writing, because I do think it's very difficult for students to have like a set of bricks which they then put together. And that's often the way it's a set of bricks that they then put together in some huge edifice. And I suppose that's why the idea of doing lots of short tasks, but which always have some sort of writing outcome, even if that outcome doesn't actually show the particular thing that they were learning, is still important. I don't know if that helps. I'm kind of trying to respond to what I think Karen's saying there. Harriet's asked, how do you help your students to see the importance of developing writing skills for future work prospects beyond school exams? I think I said in the talk that I find the whole idea of extrinsic motivation difficult. I remember again talking to my mother was a French teacher, and one of the conversations we had was, she said, "Oh, as an English teacher, you're lucky because all students understand English is important to their world." She said, "As a French teacher, they never have to use French. They don't even use it when they go on a day trip." And I'd argue actually that's almost equally true for English. I don't think there's a sort of intrinsic feeling that they need English. So I think the motivation has to come from the engagement with the task being interesting and engaging in its own right. I suppose the only thing I would say, and I haven't mentioned this in the talk, was that I was a strong advocate when I worked with the framework, with the National Literacy Strategy, for having a lot more about what I would call professional writing brought into the classroom. Do students really know, for example, how people write a TV sitcom? Do they understand there's a writer's room where people sit around and exchange ideas? Those sorts of things where they're looking at, how does a novelist go about writing a book? They don't sit down with a timed exam. They're working with notebooks. They're made, all of them work differently. But I think the more that we can help students to engage with what I might call real life writing by professional writers, so that I think the better. And it's not an easy thing to do. As money's short, you can't, it's more difficult to bring authors into schools. It's more difficult perhaps to access those sorts of resources. But I think, that's possibly one way. Perhaps if you've got access, again, it's dependent on people being able to come back into school, whether they are ex-students who have gone on to careers. I did some work recently on the gaming industry, developing some educational resources for the gaming industry, and which was fascinating because it made me realise how much of the gaming, video game industry depended on the sorts of skills that English students use. Now that's a really kind of interesting area that would engage them if you could, if you could bring that in and say, look, how is this? How are these games developed? How was the world built for this game? And you could then link it to how a world is built in, say, Jane Eyre or in Macbeth, because they have world building in the same way. So I think those things, possibly there are ways of doing that. Sorry, Harriet, that was a very, very long answer to a short question. So question about writing as a discrete skill, but how much are reading skills linked to good writing? I think they certainly are. I mean, I suppose the only reason I talk about writing as a discrete skill was I sometimes feel that, there's a way in which by linking the two, which inevitably they are, we can sometimes not focus on those specific things which help students to write. But I mean, going back again to my days working for the National Literacy Strategy, we talked about a teaching model for writing, which talked about starting with a text, which you deconstructed with the class, and then through a process of shared writing, you reconstructed it, or a version of the same text for students. And there was a very clear link between starting with a form of text, which you then looked at how it worked and how it was constructed. Then you moved on to students creating a very similar text with your guidance, and eventually letting go of the reins in the same way we talked about. So, I mean, inevitably, those reading skills are linked to good writing. But I think, I did use the example of my daughter, who has become a very accomplished writer, who actually didn't read a lot of literature, but of course she did read lots of other things. And many of those things were literary in their construction, even if they weren't fiction. And I think, it's probably pretty difficult to be a good writer without reading at all. So final thing to mention. We've got a prize draw for anybody who has participated and linked into the webinar, which is for a copy of the pack, which has videos that go with it as well. If there aren't any more questions, then just want to say, obviously we'll make sure whoever wins that gets to hear about it, and I hope that they find the pack useful. If there aren't any more questions, I'm probably going to wrap up now and just thank you all for attending. The recording's going to be going out so that you can check it out too. Thank you very much, and I hope you found it useful.